So here's the first question that we're going to tackle today. How do I build my key workouts to optimize my improvements? So before we get too deep into that, we have to understand a little bit of the background of styles of training before we can get too deep into specific training principles. So one of the things that I want to present to you guys today is maybe a little bit familiar, but maybe you don't think about this too much when you're, if you're an athlete, you kind of just are following the training program, but most of the coaches should kind of have an idea of this. So there's two training models or styles of training that coaches will use when delivering training programs. The first is called the threshold training model, and the second is called the polarized training model. And in the very first webinar presentation, we talked about the first aerobic threshold and the second aerobic threshold, and we talked about the zones that kind of correlate with those thresholds or in between those thresholds. On the top graph, you can see how we have that first arrow that corresponds to the aerobic threshold. The second arrow corresponds to anaerobic threshold, so LT1 aerobic, LT2 anaerobic. And you can see how the training intensity and the training curve looks like an inverse U. So basically what we're looking at here is training frequency. As the line goes up, it basically is saying that it's increasing the frequency of training done in that zone. So for the threshold training model, you're doing not very much training in zone 1, a lot of training in zone 3, so between the thresholds, and not very much training in zone 4+. So that's what that threshold training model is showing for us. The polarized training model is showing kind of the opposite. It's more like a U shape, and we can see again those same two arrows. So VT1, LT1, that represents the aerobic threshold. VT2, LT2, that represents the anaerobic threshold. And what we're seeing here is that for this polarized training model, we have a lot of training frequency, so a lot of time spent in zone 1 or zone 1-2. We have not very much time spent in zone 3, and we have a lot of time spent in zone 4+. And so that's the polarized training model. So both of these training models will have pros and cons. So for example, a good thing that people will use the threshold training model for is that it might be more beneficial for athletes who don't have a lot of time. So if you have a very limited amount of time to dedicate to training, so maybe like less than 8 hours or 8 hours and less per week, then you might choose to use a threshold training model because you don't have enough time to do a lot of zone 1. A con of using the threshold training model is that science has shown that in elite athletes, the athletes will typically plateau a lot sooner and not be able to make further improvements in their training using the threshold training model. So it might be good for an athlete who doesn't have a lot of time, who's not able to kind of commit a lot of time to training, but it might limit their ability to improve as they increase their training volume. The polarized training model, it's kind of the opposite, where the con is that you have to spend a lot of time training in zone 1. But the pro is that a lot of science and research has shown that if you want to maximize your performance as an athlete moving towards highly competitive or elite athletes, that this model is shown to be more effective for improving performance than the threshold training model. So that's just a little bit of background when we're talking about different, like building a training program, the different styles of training that we're using, just something to keep in mind. When we talk about how we're building our workouts specifically, we're going to have to put some lingo on quantifying effort. So how do we talk about, sorry for my graph not looking so pretty here. So we're going to talk about less so zone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we're going to talk, we can refer to it a little bit. So if you guys get confused what I'm talking about, feel free to ask a question and say like, are we talking about zone 1? Are we talking about zone 3? But we're going to also talk about in relation to high intensity interval training, we're going to talk about low intensity interval training or low intensity training. It's not intervals, low intensity training, moderate intensity training, and high intensity interval training. So when we're looking at this graph, it ended up being super messy as it translated from Canva to my PowerPoint today. My apologies, but low intensity training, that's our zone 1, 2. And I'm going to use something called RPE in my discussion today about intensity. And RPE is rate of perceived exertion. And some of you might be more familiar with this than others, but it's essentially you thinking to yourself, how hard does this feel right now? So rate of perceived exertion. How hard does this feel right now on a scale of 1 to 10? So low intensity training, a zone 1 or 2 workout, how hard does this feel right now? It should be around 1 to 4. You know, 1 being like maybe like a walk or an easy hike, 4 being like I'm probably going the fastest that I can at my aerobic speed, very close to my aerobic threshold. I'm maybe not producing lactate yet, so I don't feel any kind of burning or fatigue sensations at all, but I probably, if I went a little bit faster, I probably would. Our moderate intensity training, that's in between our thresholds, and that is our zone 3 typically. And when we're talking about RPE, that RPE is about 5 to 7. So 7 usually kind of correlates almost exactly with anaerobic thresholds. So an RPE of 7 is usually like at or just below threshold. So we have zone 3 RPEs 5 to 7, and then we have our high intensity interval training, and that usually corresponds with an RPE of 8 to 10. So I am like 10 is I'm working as hard as I possibly could. This is as hard as I can go, or this feels very hard. We're going to talk a little bit about using heart rate. And again, I apologize, my numbers there look a little bit messy. But we're also going to talk about the challenges of using heart rate to prescribe intensity training, because there are a couple. And I know that cross-country skiers really like using heart rate to prescribe training because it's the most kind of vigorous thing that we have, in the sense that we don't really have power training. We use a lot of different modalities, so we may not know what speed we typically train at because it's undulating terrain. So often we resort back to using heart rate. So typically that aerobic threshold corresponds to somewhere between 60 to 70% of your maximum heart rate, and your anaerobic threshold corresponds to about 80 to 90% of your maximum heart rate. So you can consequently think how low intensity training is anything below that, like somewhere between 60 and 70. High intensity is anywhere above that 80 to 90. And that moderate intensity, that zone 3, is kind of in between. So we're going to kind of keep that in mind as we talk about quantifying our effort with our different varieties of training here. So I mentioned that there are some challenges using heart rate to prescribe training. Heart rate can be a lot more effective to prescribe light or moderate training than it can be to describe like heavy or intense training. And the reason is, I've got a little bit like a sciencey graph for you here to help you understand. But what we're seeing in this graph here is that our heart rate, which is the bottom 2 figures, so we have light intensity on the red graphs, and we have high intensity on the blue graphs. And at the very bottom on both sides, we see heart rate. And on the red graph, we can see how if you were to do a constant intensity, so let's say you went out, you did a constant intensity, you're running on a treadmill and you're running at the same speed for 10 minutes. You can see that if it's a light intensity, so you're below that anaerobic threshold, your heart rate will come up to a certain point and it'll plateau. So if you're trying to use heart rate to use for training to determine how hard you're working in light or moderate exercise, then it's probably pretty effective, because you can just kind of like go up to a certain value and stay there. However, you can see on the other side, if you're doing more heavy exercise, as soon as you kind of like get up to that plateau, you can see how there's this drift, how even at a constant intensity, the heart rate will drift and slowly start to increase. And there are a couple of reasons behind this, but the one that's easiest to explain is that typically when you're doing this strenuous exercise, high intensity interval training, your stroke volume decreases. So that's that kind of middle box you can see there, stroke volume decreases, which basically means that in your body, you're dehydrating yourself a little bit. And because of that, the heart rate has to increase to maintain a constant cardiac output. So those words might be a little bit sciencey, but most of you guys, I think, have a basic understanding of the heart needing to pump a certain amount of blood to the body to meet the demands of the exercise. So when you're dehydrating yourself and your blood volume starts to decrease, your stroke volume decreases, the heart rate, the amount of times your heart has to pump, has to increase to match the amount of blood that has to go to the body. So that's one of the challenges with using heart rate to prescribe intensity, is that you may not have a constant heart rate for the same intensity level. So I'm sure that most of you guys have experienced occasions where you've been out for a workout, whether it's a hot day or it's just a hard workout, and you feel like your RPE, or your rate of perceived exertion, how hard it feels, kind of maintains. That you're like, okay, well, like I'm working at about the same rate, I'm running about the same speed. Maybe if you're biking, I'm at the same power output, or You know, running on a track, I'm hitting the same split, but my heart rate is significantly higher, even though it feels about the same. And that would be an example of heart rate drift. So that's why I'm going to use RPE today to talk about prescribing intensity. You can use, if you train other modalities aside from roller skiing, running, you can often use speed as a good indicator for prescribing intensity. Cycling, you can use power, which is a really concrete way to prescribe intensity. But in roller skiing, we don't yet have the ability to prescribe training aside from RPE or heart rate. So you have to kind of rely on a combination of those two tools. You have to pick the one that's most effective for the training that you're trying to do.